Okay, so let's start this off. So Dr. Rebecca DeWolf is a historian. She has a Ph.D. in history from the American University. She has extensive experience as an educator, researcher, and writer. Her areas of expertise include European history and United States history, and her thematic specialties include gender and women's history, politics, and United States constitutional culture. Her research has achieved recognition through several awards and grants, including the Dirksen Center Congressional Research Grant, American University's Vice Provost Doctoral Research Award, and a Clendenin Dissertation Fellowship at American University. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, History News Network, New America Weekly, and Frontiers. Her book, Gendered Citizenship, was published by the University of Nebraska Press in the fall of 2021, just last year. Her book explores the contours of women's civic standing in the post-suffrage era through an examination of the competing civic ideologies embedded in the conflict over the Equal Rights Amendment from 1920 to 1963. It is super interesting. I highly recommend it. And I am pleased to welcome Dr. Rebecca DeWolf. Thank you for being here.
Yes, okay. I'm going to try to share my screen here. All right. There we go. I'm just going to close this. All right. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Oh, there we go. My name is Rebecca DeWolf, and I am a historian with a PhD in history from American University. My newly released book from the University of Nebraska Press, Gendered Citizenship, builds on my PhD dissertation research. That research looks at the changing nature of U.S. citizenship after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And for those that are not as familiar with the history, I'll just note that the 19th Amendment removed sex as a valid reason for withholding the right to vote. It's often known as the amendment that affirmed women's right to vote. So one of my main areas of historical research has been to look at how the removal of sex as a valid reason for withholding the right to vote impacted the US legal tradition, because so much of the US legal system was built around the idea that only men were fit for rights-bearing citizenship. So this evening, I want to discuss with you all a few of the key aspects of my book. My book explores the competing civic ideologies embedded in the original conflict over the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA. And many of you might be thinking, okay, what the heck does she mean by competing civic ideologies? And what does that have to do with the 19th Amendment? And wasn't the ERA basically dead until the 1970s? And this evening, I'm going to try to sort that all out. It's probably best to first lay out some of the ERA's basic historical background. Even though much attention has been paid to the ERA struggle as it unfolded in the 1970s, the amendment was actually first devised in the early 1920s. In 1923, after an arduous, almost 3-year drafting process, Alice Paul, the National Women's Party, NWP, and the principal author of the ERA settled on a version of the amendment which read, quote, "Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States in every place subject to its jurisdiction." In December of that year, Senator Charles Curtis and Representative Daniel Reed Anthony Jr. introduced the ERA into Congress. In 1943, Alice Paul reworded the amendment so that it aligned more closely with the language of the 19th Amendment. To this day, the primary first clause of the amendment reads, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Most of the existing literature on the ERA examines the state ratification struggles of the 1970s and early 1980s. So these works have been mostly concerned with figuring out why the ERA failed to get enough state ratifications when things had looked so promising for the amendment in the early 1970s. Some of these works look at the political difficulties ERA supporters encountered, and some of them look at Phyllis Schlafly's revitalization of grassroots conservatism and its devastating impact on the ERA state ratification battles. Yet these works tend to make it seem like the ERA struggle was silent or dormant before the 1970s. As I discuss in my book, if we want to know why the ERA failed to get enough state approvals during the 1970s state ratification battles, we have to return to the earlier conflict, because the original ERA conflict created the US's gendered citizenship. Now, there are a few other works that have explored the earliest years of the ERA conflict. These works have looked at the struggle mostly in the 1920s and a little bit in the early 1930s. For the most part, these works understand the earliest years of the ERA struggle as a dispute among women, about women, and only concerning women. These works have mostly framed the early conflict as a fight between feminists over the priorities of the women's movement after the passage of the 19th Amendment. So this second body of work has primarily employed a female-centric narrative that emphasizes how the early ERA campaign affected the women's movement. Now, the previous writing on the ERA has offered incredibly important insights, but my study maintains that the original ERA conflict is best understood not mainly as a struggle between feminist ideologies, but rather as a conflict between competing civic ideologies. So one of the things I attempted to show with my book is that the ERA conflict before the 1970s was not just a bunch of feminists arguing with one another about the trajectory of the women's movement after the passage of the 19th Amendment. To be clear, a crucial aspect of the original conflict did involve disputes among female activists over the priorities of the women's movement, but the focus on these disputes has concealed the larger story and significance of the original ERA conflict. As I show in my book, when you take a wider view of the ERA struggle, so when you look at it before the 1970s and examine how the conflict involved more groups than just women activists who had been associated with the suffrage struggle, you start to see that the conflict involved more than just women fighting with one another over the priorities of women's activism. As I argue in my book, the original conflict not only involved former suffragists, but it actually included an array of men and women, politicians, intellectuals, labor activists, social reformers, and government officials. Although strands of feminism undoubtedly influenced the aspects of the original battle, the larger conflict encompassed a struggle over the fundamental principles of US citizenship. So the participants in the original conflict argued about the concept of rights, and there were intense concerns about how to determine women's rights as citizens now that women presumably had a constitutional recognition of their right to vote. So the story of the ERA begins with the passage of the 19th Amendment because that amendment profoundly altered women's relationship to the state. To start, the 19th Amendment disrupted the traditional understanding of US citizenship that had given men authority over women in law and in custom. Before the 19th Amendment, US political leaders upheld a single standard for full citizenship status, which venerated masculine strength and followed the common law tradition of domestic relations, or the doctrine known as coverture. According to COVERTURE, women did not possess a direct relationship to the state. It also presumed that married women held no civic identity separate from their husband's status. In essence, COVERTURE submerged a woman's civic identity into her husband's status. Sorry, my nose is so congested. Okay. A dominant belief in early US society was that the majority of women married. So COVERTURE also stood for the legal process by which women moved from dependent daughter to dependent wife. The idea that women were naturally dependent creatures who relied on men for survival permeated early US society so deeply that it was commonly held in law and in custom that women were under the authority and control of the male head of the household, whether it be their father, brother, or husband. While women, specifically white women before the Civil War, and then also Black women after the Civil War, were understood to be citizens and that they were inhabitants of the country, they were excluded from the concept of rights-bearing citizenship because women were seen to be incapable of maintaining an independent, autonomous relationship to the state. Coverture also signified a system of sex-specific marital duties in which wives were thought to owe their husbands services such as childbearing and homemaking. In return, the legal tradition presumed that husbands provide their wives with shelter and financial support. And treating women as covered by their husbands, coverture imposed several restrictions on married women, which included their inability to hold property, draft wills, control their earnings, to sue and be sued, to vote, to hold public office, serve on juries, and enter into contracts. While certain state-level reforms in the mid-19th century did allow women to start having more agency in their ability to hold property, there were significant limitations to these reforms, which allowed men to continue to exert authority over women, especially in regard to women's domestic labor and women's rights in the public sphere. As a result, elements of coverture continued to play a determining role in the confinement of women's civic identity well into the early 20th century, which I discuss in length in the first chapter of my book. When US lawmakers finally passed the 19th Amendment, it displaced this earlier societal framework that had given men authority over women. But it also failed to provide a unified set of principles for determining women's rights as citizens after sex had been removed as a valid reason for withholding the right to vote. Because of the destabilizing nature of the 19th Amendment, a period of constitutional uncertainty developed in which political leaders and legal authorities clashed over the constitutional implications of federal women's suffrage. At issue in these debates was whether voter status commanded other civic rights. So in these debates, political leaders and legal authorities wrestled over the following questions. Did the passage of the 19th Amendment mean that women should be treated as citizens on similar terms of men? If sex was no longer a valid reason for withholding the right to vote, could it still be a valid reason for withholding other rights? And what are the rights of citizenship after all? Is sex still a legitimate reason for limiting or restricting women's ability to work in certain occupations, serve on juries, hold public office, and have an independent nationality status? And what about the array of state laws that still favored husbands and fathers over wives and daughters with relation to property, earnings, contracting, inheritance, and guardianship? So these debates played out in several court cases and in the political discourse of the post-19th Amendment era. Most importantly for our discussion tonight, this period of uncertainty prompted several individuals to consider pursuing additional federal legislative measures to clarify women's legal personhood in the post-19th Amendment era. Alice Paul, the National Women's Party, NWP, took the lead in this effort. Now, just in case anyone's not familiar with Alice Paul, I'll just give a little bit of background. Alice Paul was a vitally important, influential part of the suffrage movement. She created the NWP in 1916 after she became dissatisfied with the leadership at NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Paul was a brilliant strategist for attracting the attention of the press and the overall public to the suffrage movement. The NWP, for instance, was the first group to picket the White House for a political cause, and her suffrage parade during President Wilson's inaugural celebration captured the nation's attention by featuring more than 8,000 suffragettes. With Paul's guidance, the NWP drew national focus to what had appeared to be the hypocrisy of a nation that championed democracy in World War I while still denying its own citizens the right to vote. With Paul's leadership, the NWP was able to help push the federal women's suffrage amendment past Congress and the states with full ratification in August 1920. In the rising uncertainty over the constitutional effects of the 19th Amendment, Paul decided to pursue additional measures to clarify women's rights in the wake of federal women's suffrage. In the early months of 1921, Alice Paul had envisioned creating a limited federal bill that would include the theory of equality between men and women while providing a short list of discriminations to be eliminated. These discriminations include giving women an independent nationality status, prohibiting discriminations against women in federal government service, and removing existing discriminations against women in the Code of the District of Columbia. Paul intended for this bill to act as a model for state-level measures that NWP members would push their state legislatures to adopt. But Paul encountered some problems with the limited federal model bill. As letters between NWP members demonstrate, the leadership of the organization was worried about the best way to phrase the federal bill. Disillusioned with their original strategy, Alice Paul and her fellow NWP leader, Elsie Hill, turned to the help of a talented young legal scholar, Professor Albert Levitt of the George Washington University. Levitt had already been working on the expansion of women's rights, and he would actually go on to marry and then eventually divorce Elsie Hill. Now, regarding the ERA, Paul had been thinking about pursuing an additional constitutional amendment as the uncertainty over the 19th Amendment's effects were growing. But until her meeting with Levitt, she was still leaning towards the model federal bill as the best strategy for securing women's rights in the wake of the suffrage amendment. Levitt, though, helped to tip the scale as he encouraged Paul to abandon the federal model bill and go after an additional constitutional amendment. The historic meeting between Albert Levitt, Alice Paul, and Elsie Hill occurred on a Sunday afternoon in May 1921. As Elsie Hill recalled in one letter recounting the meeting, quote, "I have never seen more continuous mental effort than those two put into this." During the meeting, Levitt persuaded Paul to pursue an additional amendment by claiming that it could be called a Women's Bill of Rights. He also crafted the first, albeit tedious, version of the amendment, which you can see here. The first section of the proposed amendment stated, quote, "The legal rights, duties, powers, privileges, capacities, and opportunities of a citizen of the United States shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or any state on account of sex." And then 8 more sections followed that detailed the specific rights that the amendment intended to secure, which include women's right to serve on juries, hold public office, and maintain their own domicile. Towards the end of the meeting, Levitt offered to show the draft of the amendment to his old law school advisor and friend, Roscoe Pound at Harvard University. Levitt dined with Paul and Hill until about 10 p.m. that night, and then he took the midnight train up to Boston to meet with Roscoe Pound. Hill and Paul were excited about the amendment and the new strategy for securing women's status as full rights-bearing citizens. Hill exclaimed to a friend in one letter, quote, "It looks as though the amendment will be ready for introduction in 10 days. But the amendment would not be ready for introduction that summer or even that year, as an arduous, almost 3-year drafting process ensued after Levitt, Paul, and other collaborators failed to reach a consensus on the contours of the amendment's intent. The amendment would go through several different versions during this drafting process. Albert Levitt, for example, claimed that he wrote over 75 different versions, while Alice Paul mentioned in one letter that she had written several hundred drafts. As the amendment went through different versions, it became more streamlined and more focused on upholding the theory of equality between men and women. Roscoe Pound was influential in convincing Paul and Levitt to make the amendment as short as possible and to not go overboard with listing all the rights that they were trying to secure. In his mind, a lengthy amendment would be too cumbersome and harder to get passed. At first, the effort to draft the additional constitutional amendment was quite collaborative. Up until the fall of 1921, Paul actively sought advice and assistance from various activists, reformers, lawyers, and legal scholars. Several lawyers within the NWP helped Paul with the writing of the amendment, including Caroline Spencer and Bernita Shelton Matthews. And this is a list of just some of the people that offered up drafts and assistance in the beginning. It's not everyone, but it's some. Roscoe Pound wrote several drafts of the amendment, as well as Shippen Lewis, a lawyer and son of NWP member Dora Lewis. Labor activist and lawyer Frank Walsh also offered support, as well as George Gordon Battelle, a leading Democrat and prominent New York City lawyer. Just going to take a sip of water. Future presidential advisor, also Dean Acheson, also helped in the beginning, as well as Florence Kelly at the National Consumers League. She also offered some insights in the initial drafting period. During this time, NWP members also met with Ethel Smith at the National Women's Trade Union League and Mary Anderson at the Women's Bureau for their feedback and advice on the phrasing of the amendment. One of the main priorities at this time was trying to construct a saving clause that would protect the law's ability to treat men and women differently in certain areas, especially in the industrial realm. Roscoe Pound was influential in urging Levitt to back a saving clause in the amendment. A saving clause was needed, Pound and Levitt maintained, because collaborators who aligned with social reform efforts like Florence Kelly at the National Consumers League, Mary Anderson at the Women's Bureau, and Ethel Smith at the National Women's Trade Union League were going to want assurances that the proposed amendment was not going to threaten special labor legislation for women. Special labor legislation, or sex-specific labor laws, arose in late 19th and early 20th centuries. These laws especially regulated women's working conditions by establishing maximum work hours for women, banning women from working at night, prohibiting women from working in certain occupations, and forbidding women from performing certain tasks during work, like lifting an item over a certain weight limit. Special labor legislation grew out of ideas rooted in coverture and the common law tradition. Specifically, it grew from what some scholars have called the dependent woman theory, or the idea that women are inherently dependent creatures who require protection and extra special legal treatment. While Kelly, Anderson, and Smith were interested in the idea of a constitutional amendment that would clarify women's rights in the wake of suffrage, especially the rights of women to serve on juries, hold public office, and have an independent nationality status, they were wary of an amendment that might reach too far and encroach on the legal basis for special labor legislation. At first, Paul, Hill, and fellow NWP leaders were on board with including a saving clause in the proposed amendment. In fact, Hill and Paul expressed their support for special labor legislation in their letters at the beginning of the Equal Rights Campaign. Even before Levitt had convinced Paul to pursue an additional constitutional amendment, Paul wrote of the federal model bill that, quote, "We, of course, are stating definitively that our federal model bill does not in any way contemplate changing minimum wage laws or hours of labor for women, as while society is as it is at present, we women need this protection." The original collaborative effort, however, began to fall apart when Paul and other individuals involved in the drafting process were unable to devise a saving clause that satisfied everyone. Future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter played a key role in the breakdown of the original collaborative effort. When Paul decided to pursue a constitutional amendment, she immediately sought Frankfurter's assistance. Frankfurter was an influential legal force and a major backer of special labor legislation for women. He was also close to social reformers like Florence Kelly. But Frankfurter became quite annoyed with Paul and the entire concept of a constitutional amendment that espoused the equality of men and women citizens. In his mind, no saving clause could be drawn up in a way that would effectively safeguard the law's ability to treat women with extra special legal protection. To push Paul away from the amendment approach, Frankfurter advised Paul to launch an investigation into the variations in women's legal status to examine the different state-level sex-specific laws that affected women's legal personhood. From Frankfurter's perspective, a proper investigation would look into which sex-specific laws empowered women and which ones disadvantaged women. To him, a blanket amendment declaring men and women's equality would only cause chaos and upset the US legal system because that system had been built around the supposed dependent nature of women. Partly due to Frankfurter's influence, social reformers like Florence Kelley, Mary Anderson, and Ethel Smith began to back away from the amendment. They would eventually start to actively work against it. Paul soon became frustrated with Frankfurter's refusal to back a potential saving clause, so she began to play around with the phrasing of the amendment by herself. By the fall of 1921, she had developed a version of the amendment that she had based on the language of the 13th Amendment. It read, "Neither political nor civil disabilities or inequalities on account of sex or marriage shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Paul intended to have this version of the amendment introduced into Congress in the winter of 1921. Paul based this version of the amendment on the language of the 13th Amendment, the amendment that abolished slavery, because she considered that marriage under the common law tradition of domestic relations, or coverture, formed a type of involuntary servitude for women. Her version also did not include a saving clause for sex-specific labor laws because by this time she had started to rethink the merits of such policies. Paul released this earlier version of the amendment to the press in the fall of 1921, which incited a wave of fury from social reformers like Florence Kelley, Ethel Smith, and Mary Anderson. Many other former allies felt betrayed by Paul's actions. During this time, Dean Acheson and Roscoe Pound came out against the amendment because it did not include a saving clause. Albert Leavitt, for his part, was devastated by the turn of events because he too believed that a saving clause must be included in the amendment. In the winter of 1921, he wrote Alice Paul that he realized she no longer cared for his opinions and that his advice was now, quote unquote, worthless to her. But he continued, quote, "At the same time, my interest in the problem you are trying to solve is so genuine and keen that I moved once more to urge you that a saving clause and your proposed amendment will do no harm and will do considerable good." Even though Paul and Leavitt traded a few more heated and quite emotional letters, Paul would not yield to his pleas, and for good reason. As she had guessed, the social reform allies of Frankfurter, including Kelley, Smith, and Anderson, were not going to back the amendment with or without a saving clause. In December 1921, leaders from several women's organizations, including the National Consumers League, the National Women's Trade Union League, and the League of Women Voters, met with Alice Paul and told her that they would refuse to back the amendment in any form. They contended that no matter how the amendment was worded, they could not accept its underlying principles because the very concept of constitutional equality for men and women citizens would undermine the law's ability to treat citizens differently on account of sex. As you might have guessed, Paul was quite distressed and dismayed by this outcome of events. In the early winter months of 1922, she decided to put the amendment on hold so that she and her fellow NWP members could gain a better understanding of the legal consequences of their proposed amendment. At this time, Paul decided to follow Frankfurter's suggestion from months earlier by launching an extensive investigation into the legal status of women. This massive project was conducted by the Legal Research Department of the NWP under the guidance of Bernita Shilton Matthews, a legal scholar and leading member of the organization. The purpose of this research campaign was to acquire concrete information about the variations in women's legal standing in the post-19th Amendment era. The project lasted for several years and reports were issued throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. In all, the NWP's investigation chronicled the numerous other legal discriminations that continue to restrict women's civic autonomy. The NWP's research especially dissected the common law basis for the legal prejudices against women. As the NWP's reports recorded, several states continue to maintain sex-specific policies in regard to inheritance laws, guardianship laws, labor laws, marriage and divorce laws, control over property, jury service, public office holding, docile status, married women's earning rights, and women's economic rights. As the NWP's reports showed, these laws often restricted women's opportunities and independence by favoring the male head of the household and subjecting women to extra legal control and supervision. By the fall of 1922, the leaders of the NWP had armed themselves with concrete documentation showing how sex-based legal distinctions continue to negatively affect women. Thanks to the exhaustive effort, NWP leaders now felt confident in their insistence that absolute constitutional sexual equality was the only way to free women from their legal subjugation. During this time, the NWP issued its Declaration of Principles, which came out fully against sex-based laws and customs, including special labor legislation for women. As the organization's leaders maintained, labor laws should be based on the nature of the work and not on the sex of the worker. The organization's Declaration of Principles also reaffirmed the party's support for a constitutional amendment to ensure the equal rights of men and women citizens. After the NWP announced its Declaration of Principles, Alice Paul returned to the proposed Sex Equality Amendment in the fall of 1922. All right, let me just make sure I got that. Okay. With the help of a handful of legal advisors within the NWP, including Caroline Spencer and Bernita Shelton Matthews, Paul wrote a straightforward draft of the proposed amendment. The amendment, now called the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, stated men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States in every place subject to its jurisdiction. The NWP released the language of the ERA at an outdoor pageant in Seneca Falls in July 1923 to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the first Women's Rights Convention. In the 1940s, when the ERA was gaining considerable support, Paul would once again rewrite the amendment to help its prospects in Congress. Due to suggestions from several Congress members, she rephrased the amendment so that it aligned more closely with the language of the 19th Amendment. The 1943 rephrasing of the amendment, as I mentioned before, is essentially what the amendment now looks like in regards to its first clause. Because of those changes, the amendment now reads, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. All right, emergence of competing civic ideologies. All right, but it was during those early years of the 1920s when the NWP was conducting its research program into women's legal status that ERA supporters began to develop a certain form of thought, which I describe as emancipationism. Emancipationists supported the ERA. They believed it was the logical and necessary outcome of the 19th Amendment. In their view, the strength of the American political community relied upon the equal rights of its voting citizens. The term emancipationist captures the pro-ERA position because ERA supporters often drew upon the notion of emancipating women from the harms of legalized sex discrimination. In fact, they often use the exact words emancipate or to emancipate when describing the ERA's purpose. For example, Mary Windsor, a prominent member of the NWP since the days of the suffrage campaign, emphasized the need to free women from the restrictions of legalized sex discrimination in her arguments for an additional constitutional amendment. In an article for the NWP's publication, Equal Rights, she declared, quote, women in America should emancipate themselves fully at home so as to be ready to play a part in the emancipation of women throughout the world. And amendment supporters' arguments for the ERA, they often point to how the remnants of COVERTURE had sustained women's disadvantaged position. Those restraints on women's civic autonomy, they argue, create not only fluctuating definitions of women's legal personhood, but also constitutional inconsistencies in regards to the rights of US citizens. In the mindsets of ERA proponents, complete constitutional sexual equality was the only way to fully emancipate a class of voters from their legal subjugation. The release of the finalized draft of the amendment unleashed an upsurge of intense opposition. Roscoe Pound, Felix Frankfurter, Florence Kelly, Dean Acheson, and others came out strongly against the finalized draft. From their perspectives, the amendment posed a dire threat to women's natural right to special protection, as well as to the overall stability of American society. As Dean Acheson put it at one ERA congressional hearing, quote, the amendment can do nothing useful, but it will produce the most terrific confusion, upset all existing rights, and make it impossible for any man or woman to know where he or she stands in regards to rights. As opposition to the ERA mounted, amendment opponents began to craft their own way of thinking about the rights of men and women citizens, which I identify as protectionism. So to put it simply, protectionism espouses the virtues of sex-specific laws and sex-specific rights, and encompasses the core ideas behind the anti-ERA stance. As one anti-ERA pamphlet from the National Consumers League put it, quote, men and women are different in biological structure and social function. State laws regulating working conditions for women, family support, guardianship of children, property and inheritance, marriage and divorce recognize these differences. It's important to note that in my study, protectionism does not refer exclusively to advocates of special labor legislation for women. As the opposition to the ERA grew in the early 1920s, the protectionist position developed to include not only liberal-minded persons who support labor laws for women, but also conservative-minded individuals who didn't like labor laws. Both conservative and liberal ERA opponents believed that women had a natural need for special protection. They just differed over where that protection should come from. For conservative ERA opponents, women's special protection should come from the male head of the household, while liberal ERA opponents believe that government reform efforts could also serve as an effective tool of protection for women. Even so, both conservative and liberal ERA opponents criticized the ERA as a threat to the sex-based legal distinctions that upheld what they understood to be women's natural right to special protection. So over the course of the original ERA conflict, the protectionist position included liberals and conservatives. And the original conflict, ERA opponents include individuals such as the ultra-conservative Senator Robert Taft of Ohio and New Deal liberal Democrat Frances Perkins, the first woman Secretary of Labor. A shared desire to preserve the law's ability to treat men and women differently on account of sex after the passage of the 19th Amendment fueled the protectionist position. Alongside this desire, protectionists believe that while the law should respect women as rights-bearing citizens, it should not categorically group women's rights with men's rights. As I describe in my book, protectionists reasoned that actual sexual fairness meant securing two distinct but equally valued sets of rights for men and women citizens. For protectionists, women's distinct exclusive rights include being kept safe in their domestic roles, exempted from military service, and shielded from the harms of industrial capitalism. From the 1920s through the early 1960s, protectionists and emancipationists fought over the very idea of rights. At the start of the conflict, the protectionist position was quite dominant. Even though Congress held several hearings on the amendment in the 1920s, the amendment failed to make much progress. Up until the early to mid 1930s, most Americans sided with the protectionist view because of an enduring societal attachment to women's traditional domestic duties and the political conservatism of the 1920s. Nonetheless, the supremacy of the protectionist position was not going to last forever, as ongoing economic troubles and the intense worldwide political turmoil of World War II opened the door to the rise of emancipationism. As I discuss in length in my book, support for the ERA started to grow in the mid to late 1930s because the Depression-era increase in the regulation of working women pushed more women's groups to recognize the potential disadvantages of sex-specific labor laws. For many women, such laws hindered their ability to find and maintain gainful employment. The NWP also cultivated this growing discontent with sex-specific labor policies through its Depression-era economic campaign, which especially attacked the escalating discriminations against working women. By 1937, many women's groups that had backed the NWP's economic campaign, including the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs, had become official backers of the ERA. World War II inspired even more support for the ERA because it further destabilized the traditional sexual order. Many sex-based labor laws were suspended during the war with minimum harmful effects, which then called into question the need for such policies. The war also pulled more women into the workforce, and it put them to work in unprecedented ways. For instance, more women were working in what had been traditionally male-dominated industries like shipbuilding. Because of the economic demands of World War II, women were now being asked to build the materials needed to win the war. And more people embraced the ERA during the 1940s because the economic needs of the war expanded women's public responsibilities. This new reality gave greater legitimacy to women workers, and it illuminated their value as citizens. But emancipationists could not simply rely on the changing political and social economic circumstances to push the pendulum of public opinion in their favor. Rather, they had to actively connect the ERA to the pressing concerns that were preoccupying the attention of the nation's leaders. So to this end, emancipationists linked the ERA to the avowed war aims of the United States and their wartime campaign for the ERA. As Alice Paul, the ever-dedicated creator of the movement for the ERA, urged in one article, quote, "At this moment, when the United States is engaged in a war with the avowed purpose of establishing freedom and equality for the whole world, the United States should hasten to set its own house in order by seeking the immediate adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment." According to emancipationists, passage of the ERA would boost the war effort by showing that the US stood true to its democratic principles. As support for the ERA grew, influential figures and organizations came out to publicly support the amendment. By 1944, 24 national organizations had endorsed the ERA. By this point, the amendment had also gained the backing of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the first Black American women's organization to endorse the amendment. As the number of women's organizations supporting the ERA multiplied, backing for the amendment also grew among public figures and celebrities, such as actresses Katharine Hepburn and Helen Hayes, radio broadcaster Dorothy Thompson, as well as authors Pearl Buck, James Truslow Adams, and Channing Pollock. More politicians also came out in support of the amendment. In 1944, 17 Republicans and 8 Democratic governors expressed support for the amendment, and both the Democratic and Republican parties endorsed the ERA in their party platforms. As the political party platforms endorsements suggest, the war had cultivated a surge within the emancipationist position so that it grew to include a more pronounced spectrum with regards to its conservative and liberal branches. By the mid-1940s, the ranks of amendment proponents had expanded to include influential conservatives such as Republican political leader George Wharton Pepper and Democratic Representative Howard Smith. For conservative emancipationists, the ERA's inherent threat to special labor legislation fell in line with their support for private enterprise and their criticisms of the government's involvement in the economy. The ERA had also gained the support of prominent liberal figures, such as Vice President Henry Wallace, as well as Senator Claude Pepper of Florida. In contrast to their conservative counterparts, liberal-minded amendment supporters maintained that the ERA would help policymakers expand government initiatives to benefit men and women alike. So the emancipationist position in the original conflict included conservatives like Representative Howard Smith and liberals like Vice President Henry Wallace. Even with these differences in approaches, both conservative and liberal emancipationists backed the ERA as a way to ensure that men and women citizens could enjoy the same standard of rights. As I discuss in detail in my book, the wartime changes in the United States helped ERA proponents create a coalition of supporters that transcended conventional societal divisions. By the end of the war, the ranks of ERA supporters had grown to include conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, working class and upper class Americans, as well as white and Black Americans. Most importantly, around the end of the war, both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees had reported the ERA favorably. As the NWP's publication Equal Rights put it, this progress in Congress was quote unquote a splendid climax for the ERA struggle because it now appeared that the ERA stood ready for a vote in both houses of Congress. Despite the amendment's advancement, the strength of the emancipationist position steadily declined in the post-war era. As I discussed in the last chapters of my book, protectionists were able to subdue the emancipationist energy by reorganizing their opposition work into a unified group, which revived the anti-ERA campaign. This group was the National Committee to Defeat the Unequal Rights Amendment, NCDURA, which would later evolve into the National Committee on the Status of Women, the group that spearheaded the effort to create a presidential commission on the status of women. Protectionists were ultimately able to subdue the emancipationist impulse in the post-war era with a series of measures such as the Women's Status Bill, the Hayden Rider, and the President's Commission on the Status of Women. Through these measures, protectionists successfully advanced the contention that their position offered an appropriate but limited level of equality that recognized both men and women as rights-bearing citizens while preserving the law's ability to treat citizens differently on account of sex. Overall, the original ERA conflict supplied the terrain that allowed Americans to reconceptualize the concept of citizenship so that it corresponded to the changes in women's legal status after the passage of the 19th Amendment. During the original ERA conflict, amendment supporters perfected the emancipationist position by showing that a consistently applied single standard of rights for men and women citizens would be an essential step for emancipating women from the sexual inequities embedded in the US's social fabric. In contrast, amendment opponents in the original conflict produced a lasting belief in the need to protect a distinct, exclusive set of rights for women as citizens. Now, the original ERA conflict brings to light several important points about the almost century-long struggle over the ERA and the history of US citizenship. First, the original ERA conflict shows us that conservatism and liberalism are not inherently attached to either the pro or anti-ERA positions. In the original conflict, both emancipationism and protectionism contained pronounced conservative and liberal variations. Yes, certain societal developments can enhance or bring out more of the liberal or conservative elements of each position, but neither the pro or anti-ERA positions are categorically tied to either conservatism or liberalism. In other words, the ERA is not necessarily a natural wedge issue between Republicans and Democrats or conservatives and liberals. The amendment has had a long history of transcending traditional political disputes and divides, and it has the potential to do that again. Second, the original ERA conflict also shows us that when society goes through big changes or upheavals, it destabilizes the traditional sexual order, which then calls into question many of the conventional ways of doing things. Big social upheavals and changes create a potential for more people to align with the emancipationist position because those changes often highlight the entrenched problems with the status quo. And the emancipationist position inherently wants to improve the status quo by recognizing men and women's ability to enjoy the same standard of rights. The societal upheavals brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic may have produced a similar opportunity for the dominant cultural consensus to align with the ethos of emancipationism, which could then help ERA supporters get the recognition and confirmation of the amendment's full incorporation into the Constitution. But as the course of the original ERA conflict demonstrates, the desire to return to stability that has often followed such big upheavals typically creates a ripe environment for protections to regain the dominant position in the ERA struggle. Finally, the original ERA conflict shows us that opponents to the amendment are not necessarily against women having rights, women's empowerment, or even equality per se. Rather, as the original ERA conflict demonstrates, ERA opponents believe that real sexual equity means protecting a distinct, exclusive set of rights for women. In the original conflict, ERA opponents were able to suppress the allure of emancipationism or the pro-ERA position by putting forward the idea that sex-specific rights, rather than equal rights, would be fair and more beneficial for women. According to protectionists, equal rights would be harmful for women because it would take away the sex-specific rights that women need as mothers and potential mothers. In all, the protectionist victory in the original ERA conflict helped to redefine the concept of rights-bearing citizenship from a single gender masculine model to a dual gender model with two different but equally valued standards of rights for men and women citizens. But as I discuss in my book's epilogue, the protectionist notion of limited sexual equality has sustained the restrictions on women's autonomy because it excuses the discriminatory outlook that rights should be dependent on one's sex. To this point, a central idea animated the emancipationist position during the original conflict was this notion that if sex can be a reason to give or affirm rights, then sex can be a reason to deny or take away rights. In the end, complete constitutional sexual equality will only be obtainable once more people are willing to question the supposed equity of the US's gendered citizenship. And that is where I'm going to leave it for now.
Okay, so thank you very much. Wow, you covered a lot of territory.
Yeah. And my brain is tired, so if I'm not quick in my responses to questions, just bear with me.
Oh, no worries. As I mentioned before, if you can put your questions in the chat, and then we will relay those. But first, I would love to hear the BPW piece that is in your book.
Yeah, so I discuss it more in chapter 3 and chapter 4, but something that I touch upon in the presentation is support for the area started to really gain in the mid-1930s because the Depression era saw a big increase in the regulation of working women. There was a lot of sex-specific policies because the thinking was that women in the workforce were taking jobs away from men who supposedly needed the jobs more than women because men were providers for family and supposedly women were not. So there was a lot of government policies and also just private practice policies trying to push women out of the workforce. And the NWP really attacked all that increase in the regulation of working women. And they were able to build connections with other women's groups and really kind of revamp their position and how they were seen with other women's groups. And the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs is one of the first groups to come over to the ERA and to the National Women's Party. And I don't want to get too much into specifics, but one of the big things that the federal government did was something called Section 213 of the Economy Act in 1932, which basically really forced married women out of federal government workforce. And that was something that really alarmed the National Women's Party. And they were really spearheaded the attempts to try to get that measure rescinded. And through their efforts is when they started to really build an alliance with the National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs.
Well, I think that falls in line with what we've heard.
Yeah.
So I do have a question. What's the status of the ERA today?
That's a great question. So I'll just preface my response as I am a historian, so I do much better in offering concrete analyses and opinions and conclusions on events when the dust has settled and not when they're currently unfolding. I taught a course on the ERA last semester, and I told my students that I see the ERA, the history of the ERA is really one long story that can be divided into sections. The first conflict from the 20s up into the early 1960s, the second conflict from the 70s up into the early 1980s, and arguably we're in a third ERA conflict right now with the recent state ratification. So I'm not sure how familiar the audience here is with the the recent ERA campaign, but it has achieved the 3 additional states necessary for full ratification: Nevada in 2017, Illinois in 2018, and Virginia in 2020. So arguably it has met the requirements for full ratification, but there are lingering questions about the potential viability of the deadline that Congress attached to the ERA when it passed the ERA in 1972. And also there are questions about the state rescissions. In the 1970s, 5 states rescinded their previous ratifications of the ERA. ERA advocates and advocacy experts and feminist legal strategists have put forward really great arguments of why those rescissions shouldn't matter, and that ratification is a one-way street and you can't have, you can't go backwards on it. And there is precedent with how Congress handled the ratification of the 14th Amendment, but there isn't clear-cut precedent with the Supreme Court. So if that question of rescissions came to the Supreme Court, I'm not sure how the Supreme Court would rule on it. So right now, I see like 3 different avenues for the ERA with the 3 different branches of the federal government. So I don't know how much I should go into detail on all this, but just stop me if I'm going overboard. So right now with the executive branch, so I think it was a couple of weeks ago, President Biden, his Department of Justice offered an updated memo, basically saying it didn't rescind the memo that the former President Trump's DOJ had given, which basically said, President Trump's memo basically said that the recent state ratifications don't count, the deadline's still in place, and the ERA is not ratified, and it's dead. And Biden his DOJ put out a newer memo that didn't rescind that former memo, but did say that it's open to debate and that Congress and the courts should act. Some ERA advocacy workers are maintaining that Biden could do more and to really rescind the previous memo and to really open the doorway for the archivists to certify and publish the amendment. So that's the executive branch. The judicial branch, there's court cases going on right now with, I think actually Virginia recently stepped out of the court cases, but Illinois and Nevada are in court right now trying to get federal judges to rule that the archivist needs to certify the amendment that has met the requirements. So that's where the judicial pathway is. I think it's quite possible that might get up to the Supreme Court some way. And then with the legislative branch, in March 2021, the House passed a measure basically saying that the ERA was ratified, that the deadline should be removed, and that it's good to go. And that measure is in the Senate right now, but we all know that things are very hard to get done in the Senate. So I will say, as an observer and somebody that's watching everything happen, in my own personal opinion, I think that each branch of the government is going to have to do something to affirm its ratification in order to ensure that it's fully enforced and abided by. So I don't think it will be enough just for one branch to do something. But that's my personal opinion. So.
No, that's interesting. I haven't heard that, that take before. So why did the support for the ERA decline in the post-World War II era? Because it seems like it should have gone the other way.
I know it was, ERA supporters, especially members of the National Women's Party, they really thought that the 40s was the moment for the ERA. Things looked just so good for it. And it was such a popular thing to support. It had support from all spectrums of society. But there's 2 big factors. I don't want to go too much into detail. I probably will do a better job explaining it in my book than I'm going to do right now. But 2 big factors really influenced why the ERA started to decline in support in the post-war period. So one is there was a post-war readjustment anxiety that really permeated all aspects of US society. When the war ended, there was a desire to return to stability. And a lot of policymakers were very afraid that if wartime women workers didn't give up their wartime jobs to the returning soldiers, that the country would slip back to another Great Depression. So there was a very big emphasis on the reinstitution of traditional sex boundaries, with men being the providers in the family and women being the homemakers. And that emphasis on the traditionally ordered family created a ripe environment for protectionists to reassert themselves, which they did. So protectionists reorganized themselves into a unified opposition group. Before, you just had different organizations opposing the ERA, but with the creation of the National Committee to Defeat the Unequal Rights Amendment, you had an umbrella organization that was really able to coordinate their attacks in the ERA, and they were really able to obstruct the ERA's pathway in Congress. And I describe it better in Chapter 5. But there's a really important paradox embedded in the legacy of World War II that's really important to emphasize. And that's even though the numbers of women working outside the home declined in the immediate aftermath of the war, the numbers of women working actually started to increase again. So by 1948, the numbers of women working outside the home started to climb, such that by the early 1950s, the numbers of women working outside the home was higher than the wartime peak. So the idea that after the war ended, women went home and stayed home is actually kind of a myth. They went home and then they went back to work. And that's because of the expansion of the US consumer society. As the consumer society is expanding, more and more American families are relying on the income of two spouses, husband and wife. So it's a move away from the male breadwinner model of the family. And as more and more women, especially married women, are working outside the home, it's aligning with the emancipationist outlook that women should be free to choose how to participate in life. And so there was a lingering emancipationist impulse in the late 1940s and early 1950s, such that even though the ERA had nowhere near the level of support that it had in the early to mid 1940s, it was still around a bit. So both political parties endorsed the ERA in 1948. The ERA came to the Senate floor in 46, 1950, and 1953. So it's just floating around, and protectionists are finding it to be really annoying that it just won't go away. So that's when they rethink their opposition strategy, and they launch what they call a positive program for defeating the amendment. So I really dive into this in Chapter 6. They come up with all these alternative measures to really say, hey, look, you can do things to help and support and care for women without complete constitutional sexual equality. You can have a level of equality that will also recognize special protection and special consideration for women. So these measures like the Women's Status Bill, the Hayden Rider, and the President's Commission on the Status of Women is really the biggest one, are really trying to get after this idea of securing an equality of status with a differentiation in rights in order to preserve the law's ability to treat citizens differently on account of sex.
Okay, we do have a question. Yeah, what can we do now?
Okay, so that's such a great question. And I have a note here that I gave a presentation for the ERA North Carolina Alliance last week. And let me just preface, I'm a historian. So like the advice and everything that I'm going to give, I'm not an ERA advocacy expert. So just bear with me here. These are just my opinions, but I think it's very important to recognize even today within the opposition position, there are these deep fears that equal rights would mean taking away something from women, would actually be harmful for women. One of the presidents of the ERA North Carolina Alliance actually sent me an op-ed that an ERA opponent wrote in a local Maine newspaper because she said it just reminded her so much of protectionism. I'll just read a quote for you. So this is an ERA opponent in a recent article. She wrote, "Many supporters of the amendment want to chalk this up to a fight between those who think women are equal with men and those who don't. This is wrong. Everyone should believe that women are created equal before God. Now everyone thinks that this is an excuse to ignore basic biological facts while writing our laws." So I think it's really important to realize that ERA opponents aren't necessarily against the idea of equality or having women be respected as rights-bearing citizens. They just really think that women should have an exclusive set of rights. And it's important to recognize that on the pro-ERA position, because it pushes the pro-ERA position to emphasize how and why the law should let citizens function as individuals and not have their rights and thus their social roles be predetermined at birth based on their reproductive anatomy. And it pushes the pro-ERA side to articulate that there can be an equality of rights because there can be an equality of social responsibilities among people of all genders, and that special consideration and protection can be provided in the law based on the activity a person is engaging in or affected by, and not predetermined at birth based on one's sex. So.
Okay, and Megan, our national president, has put into the chat our national Take Action and Advocacy link, as well as an event that's the advocacy is doing. Tell your senators to remove the arbitrary ERA deadline. So check out those links, ladies, and you'll be doing something and getting involved. Okay, are there any other questions that we have for Rebecca? There's just one more thing that I have on here that I was curious about when I saw this question. What can the original ERA conflict tell us about the ERA's current status? So, yeah, how are they related? Or seems like you covered it.
Yeah, I did, but I'll just say really quickly, just to bring it home, if you will. One of the main arguments of my book is that the original ERA conflict created the US's gendered citizenship, which has prolonged the societal disadvantages against women. So in the original ERA conflict, ERA opponents were able to suppress the allure of the ERA and emancipationism by creating a confidence in the supposed equity of sex-specific treatment that still shapes US society to this day. So one of the questions that I had to myself over 10 years ago when I first became interested in the ERA was, why hadn't ongoing sex discrimination not caused a more robust, ubiquitous, lasting push for the ERA? Why was this taking so long to be ratified? And the answer that I came to in my research and writing of this book was that ERA opponents in the original conflict were able to put forward and advance this notion that it was fair and more equitable to have a separation in rights rather than equal rights, because they put forward this idea that women have special obligations in the home that men don't have and that men cannot do. And because women have these special roles in the home, they have special needs, and special rights can only attend to those special needs. The problem with that outlook, though, is that it, as I said in the presentation, it excuses the discriminatory attitude that rights should be dependent on one's sex. Again, one of the ideas that animated the pro-ERA position in the original conflict is that if sex can be a reason to affirm or give rights, then sex can be a reason to deny and take away rights.
Okay, well, it is just about 7 o'clock, and Dr. DeWolf, I want to thank you so much. Amazing presentation.
Thank you.
I think we all, Kathy threw something in here. Do you think that the protectionist view fuels the reproductive freedom?
Oh, that's such a good question. Oh, that's so good. I wish I had more time to answer it. Okay, just bear with me. I have a little bit of a long answer. So the role of reproductive freedom and abortion is not as explicit in the original conflict as it was in the 70s. So for this project, I was most interested in really trying to unravel the direct, explicit ideas and claims and arguments on the pro and anti-ERA position. So I didn't dive into the struggle for reproductive freedom as much. I'm actually in the beginning stages of a mini project where I'm trying to look at the criminalization of abortion in the 19th century and if it has any connections to the movement to try to secure a separate legal existence for married women. So my hope is that when I get further into that project, I'll be able to go back to the sources for this book and try to read it against the grain to see what might be embedded in the source materials. But I will say that the original conflict is still important for the history of the women's fight for reproductive freedom, because the original conflict reminds us that there are these ideas deeply embedded in the US legal tradition of denying women complete self-ownership over their bodies. One of the ideas in the common law tradition of domestic relations, or COVERTURE, was this idea that husbands had a right to the free domestic labor of their wives, but also to their wives' bodies, to have sexual access to their wives and to have their wives bear their children, that their wives had obligations to bear their husband's children. So there's a long history within the American legal tradition of denying women complete control over their bodies. So another reason that ERA supporters could say why the amendment's needed is because there needs to be a full and lasting break away from that legal bedrock that had denied women's ability to exercise full ownership and autonomy over their bodies and lives.
Explains a lot. Yeah. Because a lot of times you just sit there and you go, why? I don't understand. So this has been amazing, and it has answered a lot of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you, ladies, for joining us. This has been awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. All righty.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.